The fluorescent lights of Camp Pendleton's main cafeteria cast harsh shadows across rows of green tables, where 300 Marines sat eating lunch on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday in March. At table 47, near the back wall between the condiment station and the emergency exit, Captain Nora Vex sat alone with a tray of untouched chicken and rice, her eyes fixed on a paperback novel whose pages she hadn't turned in 20 minutes. She wore no insignia beyond her rank, no badges, no patches that might tell a story. Her flight suit was standard issue, faded from too many washings, and her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that revealed a thin scar running from her left temple to her jawline. She was 42 years old, 5'6", and to the casual observer, completely unremarkable. That was exactly how she preferred it. 3 tables away, Staff Sergeant Kyle Matson was holding court with 6 of his buddies from 2nd Battalion, their laughter cutting through the cafeteria noise like a knife. Matson had just returned from a training exercise in 29 Palms, full of stories and swagger, and he'd noticed the lone woman sitting by herself. He'd also noticed the navy wings on her chest, and that was enough to trigger something tribal in him. Marines and Navy pilots had a relationship that ranged from competitive to outright hostile, and Matson was bored enough to make entertainment out of the hierarchy. He stood up, his 6'3" frame towering over the table, and began walking toward her with his crew following like hyenas trailing a lion. "Hey there, Captain," Matson said, his voice loud enough to turn heads at nearby tables. "You lost. Officers' mess is on the other side of base." His friends snickered behind him, forming a loose semicircle that blocked Vex's exit path to the door. She looked up slowly, her gray eyes meeting his without emotion, without fear, without anything that might give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She closed her book carefully, using a napkin as a bookmark, and set it down beside her tray. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said quietly. Her voice had the kind of calm that comes from absolute certainty, the tone of someone who has faced far worse than cafeteria intimidation. Matson didn't recognize it. He saw a small woman, a Navy pilot, someone he could push around to get laughs from his friends. He saw an easy target. What he didn't see was the legend sitting in front of him. Matson leaned forward, placing both hands on the table, invading her space with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never been truly challenged. "You know what they call Navy pilots around here? Bus drivers. You just taxi us real warriors around, then go home to your air-conditioned hangars." More laughter from his crew. Vex's expression didn't change. She picked up her plastic fork and took a small bite of chicken, chewing slowly, deliberately, as if she had all the time in the world. The silence from her side of the confrontation was more unsettling than any comeback could have been. "You gonna say something?" Matson pressed, his confidence growing with each passing second of her silence. "Or did they not teach you how to talk back in flight school?" He reached out and flicked the cover of her book, sending it skidding across the table. That was his mistake. Not a big one, not yet, but the first crack in the dam. Vex caught the book without looking at it, her hand moving with a speed that seemed almost lazy but was actually practiced precision. She set it back down in its exact original position, then looked up at Matson with those gray eyes that suddenly seemed much colder than they had a moment before. "Staff Sergeant Matson," she said, and her use of his name without introduction made him blink in surprise. "You should probably return to your table." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact delivered in the same tone someone might use to mention the weather. Behind Matson, one of his friends, a corporal named Davies who'd been in the Corps a bit longer than the others, suddenly went very quiet. He was looking at Vex with a different expression now, his eyes narrowing as if trying to place a face he'd seen somewhere before. Matson, oblivious to his friend's change in demeanor, laughed out loud. "Or what? You gonna fly a helicopter at me?" The cafeteria had gone quieter now. Other Marines were watching, some with amusement, others with the kind of anticipation that comes before a bar fight. Vex stood up slowly, and despite being nearly a foot shorter than Matson, something about her movement made him take an involuntary step backward. She picked up her tray, walked around him as if he were simply an obstacle rather than a threat, and headed toward the dish return. Matsson's face flushed red. Being ignored was worse than being challenged. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he called after her, his voice echoing off the cinderblock walls. Vex dumped her tray and turned back around. The entire cafeteria was watching now. 300 sets of eyes locked on this confrontation between a towering Marine sergeant and a small Navy captain who showed no fear whatsoever. She walked back toward Matsson, not hurrying, not posturing, just walking with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of doing. "You want to know where I learned to talk back?" she asked, her voice still quiet but now carrying across the silent cafeteria with perfect clarity. "I learned it in places where talking back meant the difference between living and dying. I learned it in cockpits at night over hostile territory with no lights and no support. I learned it in situations where the only voice in my headset was my own, telling me to keep flying when every instinct said to punch out." She stopped 3 feet from Matsson, close enough to make her point but far enough to maintain professional distance. Matsson opened his mouth to respond, but Davies grabbed his arm. "Sarge," Davies said urgently, his voice low. "Sarge, we should go." But Matsson shook him off, too committed now to back down in front of everyone. "I don't care about your little helicopter stories," Matsson said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're Navy, you fly where we tell you to fly. You're a taxi service with wings." Vex tilted her head slightly, and for the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered across her face. "Helicopters," she repeated, and there was a note in her voice that made the hair stand up on the back of Davies' neck. "Staff Sergeant, I haven't flown helicopters in 20 years. That's when Colonel Marcus Wade walked into the cafeteria, his boots clicking on the linoleum floor with the distinctive rhythm of command authority. He took one look at the scene, at Matsson and his friends surrounding Vex, at the silent crowd of Marines watching, and his face went carefully neutral. Wade was a 48-year-old veteran of 3 wars, a man who'd seen enough combat to recognize danger in its many forms. And right now, he recognized it in the small, calm woman standing in the center of a hostile circle. "Staff Sergeant Matsson," Wade said, his voice cutting through the tension like a sword through silk. "I need to see you in my office. Now." Matsson turned toward the colonel, relief and confusion mixing on his face. "Sir, I was just—" Wade held up one hand, silencing him. "Now, Staff Sergeant." Then Wade turned to Vex and did something that made every Marine in the cafeteria straighten in their seats. He saluted her. Not casually, not perfunctorily, but with the kind of respect reserved for heroes and legends. Vex returned the salute with equal precision, her face still showing no emotion, but something in her eyes suggested she appreciated the gesture. Wade turned and walked out, Matsson following behind him like a confused puppy, his friends trailing uncertainly. The cafeteria remained silent for a long moment after they left, then the whispers started. Low at first, just a murmur of questions and speculation, but growing louder as people pulled out phones and started searching. Davies stood frozen at table 47, his face gone pale, staring at Vex like he'd just seen a ghost. "I know who you are," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Holy shit, I know who you are." Vex picked up her book from the table, tucked it under her arm, and looked at Davies with those cold gray eyes. "Then you know why you should forget this happened," she said quietly. "And you know why you should make sure your friends forget it too." She walked past him, heading for the exit, and Davies didn't try to stop her. He just watched her go, his mind racing through stories he'd heard, legends he'd dismissed as exaggeration, impossible tales of a pilot who'd done things that shouldn't have been possible. In Colonel Wade's office, Staff Sergeant Matsson stood at attention while Wade sat behind his desk, fingers steepled in front of his face. The colonel hadn't spoken for 2 full minutes, letting the silence do its work, watching Matsson shift his weight from foot to foot with growing anxiety. Finally, Wade reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thin manila folder. He opened it and began reading, his voice flat and professional. "Captain Nora Vex, call sign Spectre, 22 years of service. Navy SEAL insertion and extraction specialist, 347 combat missions, 7 distinguished flying crosses, 2 Navy crosses, 1 Medal of Honor. Wade looked up at Matson, whose face had gone from confused to horrified. She flew the mission that extracted Bravo team from Fallujah in 2004 when they were surrounded by 200 insurgents. She flew through a sandstorm in zero visibility, landed in a hot LZ with RPGs coming from 3 directions, held position for 9 minutes under sustained fire while wounded SEALs loaded, and flew out with half her rotors damaged. 3 of those SEALs she saved are now officers in this battalion. Wade closed the folder and stood up, walking around his desk to stand inches from Matson's face. She didn't fly helicopters, Staff Sergeant. She flew MH-60 Seahawks and MH-47 Chinooks into the worst combat zones in 4 different wars. She was shot down twice, crash-landed 3 times, and every single mission she flew brought everyone home alive. Every single one. Matson's mouth had gone dry. He tried to speak, but no words came out. Wade continued, relentless now, making sure the lesson sank in deep. Her call sign is Spectre because enemy forces couldn't believe she was real. They thought she was a ghost because no pilot should have been able to do what she did. She would appear out of nowhere, extract teams from impossible situations, and vanish before anyone could get a lock on her. There are Taliban fighters who still have nightmares about the sound of her rotors. Wade walked back to his desk and sat down, his voice dropping to something almost sad. She retired from combat operations 5 years ago after her last mission, where she took shrapnel from an IED through her shoulder and still flew her bird home. She could have taken a desk job, could have retired completely, but she chose to stay in, training new pilots, passing on her knowledge. Matson finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and small. "Sir, I didn't know. She wasn't wearing any." Wade cut him off with a sharp gesture. "She doesn't wear her medals because she doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. Every person in special operations knows who she is. Every SEAL, every Marine Raider, every pilot who's ever flown with Joint Special Operations Command knows that name. You didn't know because you didn't ask, because you saw what you wanted to see, because you let your ego override your judgment." The colonel picked up a pen and tapped it against his desk, the small sound loud in the quiet office. "Here's what's going to happen, Staff Sergeant. You're going to go back to that cafeteria, you're going to find Captain Vex, and you're going to apologize. Not because I'm ordering you to, but because it's the right thing to do. And then you're going to tell your friends what you learned today, and you're going to make sure this kind of behavior never happens again in my command. Do you understand me?" Matson snapped to attention, his face burning with shame. "Yes, sir. Understood, sir." Wade nodded toward the door. "Dismissed. And Matson, consider yourself lucky. In her operational days, if you'd blocked her exit like that, you'd be waking up in medical wondering what hit you." Matson left the office on shaky legs, his entire worldview having been upended in the space of 10 minutes. He found Vex 30 minutes later in Hangar 7, standing in front of an old MH-60 Seahawk that looked like it had seen better days. She was running her hand along its scarred fuselage with something that looked like affection, or maybe reverence, as if the machine were an old friend she hadn't seen in years. Matson approached slowly, his earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by something that felt a lot like awe mixed with crushing embarrassment. "Captain Vex," he said, and she turned to face him without surprise, as if she'd known he was coming. "I owe you an apology, ma'am. What I said in the cafeteria was out of line, disrespectful, and—" he struggled to find words that felt adequate and ignorant. "I judged you without knowing anything about you, and that was wrong." Vex studied him for a long moment, those gray eyes reading him like a book, seeing past the apology to the genuine shame beneath it. Then she nodded once, a small gesture that somehow conveyed forgiveness without diminishing the lesson. "Staff Sergeant, do you know why I sit alone in the cafeteria?" she asked. Matson shook his head, not trusting his voice. "Because I've spent 20 years surrounded by noise, chaos, gunfire, screaming, rotors, explosions. The silence is precious to me now. I sit alone because I've earned that peace, and because sometimes the company of a good book is better than the company of people who think they need to prove something. She turned back to the helicopter, her hand resting on its side. But I also sit alone because I know what it's like to be underestimated, to be judged by what people see instead of what you are. She looked back at him, and this time there was something almost kind in her expression. You made a mistake today. You let your assumptions override your judgment, but you're here apologizing, which means you're capable of learning. That's more than I can say for a lot of people I've met. Matson felt something loosen in his chest, relief mixing with lingering shame. Thank you, ma'am. And for what it's worth, I looked you up after Colonel Wade talked to me. What you did in Fallujah, in Helmand Province, in Mosul, I don't have words for it. You're a legend, and I treated you like you were nobody. Vex smiled then, a small, sad smile that spoke of too many memories and too many missions that hadn't made it into the official reports. Legends are just people who survived when they shouldn't have, she said quietly. Every mission I flew, I was terrified. Every landing in a hot zone, every extraction under fire, I thought it might be my last. But I had men depending on me, brothers who needed to get home, and that fear couldn't matter. So I flew anyway. She paused, her eyes distant, seeing skis and battles that Matson could only imagine. The real heroes are the ones who didn't make it home. They stood in silence for a moment, the vast hangar echoing with the distant sounds of maintenance work and radio chatter. Finally, Matson straightened and saluted, holding it until Vex returned the gesture. I won't forget this, ma'am, he said, and I'll make sure my team knows better. Vex nodded. See that you do. And Matson, next time you see someone sitting alone, consider that maybe they've earned that solitude. Not everyone wants to be part of the pack. She turned back to the helicopter, dismissing him without rudeness, simply returning to her contemplation of the old war bird. Matson walked out of the hangar feeling like a different person than the one who'd walked into the cafeteria that morning. He found Davies and the rest of his team at the barracks and told them everything, watching their faces change from skepticism to shock to something approaching reverence. By evening, the story had spread through 2nd Battalion like wildfire. Captain Nora Vex, call sign Spectre, the ghost pilot who'd saved hundreds of lives in missions that most people would never hear about. The woman they'd tried to corner and intimidate was actually a living legend who'd simply wanted to eat lunch in peace. 3 days later, Vex was walking across the tarmac toward the training hangar when she noticed something that made her stop. Outside the main cafeteria, a dozen Marines were forming a loose perimeter around one of the tables near the back, the same table where she usually sat. But they weren't threatening anyone. They were standing guard, keeping the area clear, ensuring that whoever sat there would have space and silence. At the table itself, Matson and Davies stood at attention. When Vex approached, Matson stepped forward. "Ma'am, we spoke to the battalion commander," he said, his voice formal but sincere. "This table is now designated for your use. Anyone who wants to sit here needs to respect that it's a quiet zone. No harassment, no noise, just peace." Vex looked at the table, at the young Marines standing guard, at the effort they'd put into making this happen, and something in her carefully controlled expression softened. "You didn't have to do this," she said. Matson shook his head. "Yes, ma'am, we did. We owed you more than an apology. We owed you respect." Vex sat down at her table and the Marines dispersed, returning to their own meals but keeping a watchful eye on the perimeter they'd established. She opened her book, the same paperback she'd been reading 3 days ago, and began to read. For the first time in a long time, she felt something that might have been peace. Not because the Marines were protecting her, she'd never needed protection, but because they understood now. They understood that strength comes in many forms, that heroism doesn't always look like what you expect, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room is actually the most dangerous. Over the following weeks, Vex's legend grew in the telling. Marines who'd never met her knew her name, her call sign, her history. New pilots arriving at Pendleton would hear the stories in hushed tones, tales of impossible missions and miraculous rescues. But Vex herself remained unchanged, still sitting alone at her table, still reading her books, still flying training missions with a precision that left younger pilots shaking their heads in disbelief. She didn't seek attention, didn't trade on her reputation, didn't need the validation of others to know her worth. One afternoon in late April, Vex was running a training exercise with 6 new helicopter pilots, teaching them combat insertion techniques in simulated hostile territory. The exercise was going well until one of the pilots, a young lieutenant named Morrison, made a critical error in his approach angle, coming in too steep and too fast. Vex's voice came over the radio, calm and clear despite the urgency of the situation. Ghost 2, pull up. You're overcommitting to the LZ. Gain altitude, circle, reassess. But Morrison, nervous and trying too hard, overcorrected and nearly clipped his rotor on a training obstacle. Ghost 2, abort your landing, Vex commanded, her voice still controlled but with an edge that cut through Morrison's panic. Abort now and climb to 1,000 feet. Morrison followed the order, his Seahawk lurching upward with ungainly movements that betrayed his rattled nerves. When they landed back at base, Morrison expected a dressing down that would leave his ears ringing. Instead, Vex gathered all 6 pilots in the briefing room and pulled up the footage from Morrison's near disaster. Watch this moment, she said, pointing to the screen where Morrison's helicopter hovered at a dangerous angle. This is where Lieutenant Morrison thought he'd failed. This is where his fear took over his training, where he lost confidence in his abilities. She paused the footage and turned to face the group. I've made this exact mistake. In training and in combat, every pilot in this room will make it at some point. The difference between crashing and recovering isn't talent or courage. It's the ability to hear the voice telling you to pull up and actually listen to it. Morrison looked up, surprise and relief washing over his face. You've done this, ma'am, Vex nodded. On my 14th combat mission, I came into a hot LZ in Kandahar with the same overconfidence, the same aggressive approach. My instructor that day, a salty old warrant officer named Hawks, screamed at me over the radio to abort. I nearly didn't listen because I thought I knew better. I pulled up with maybe 3 feet to spare before I would have crashed into a compound wall. Hawks made me run the insertion 20 more times that day until I got it right. She looked at each pilot in turn, her gray eyes holding them with the weight of experience. The lesson isn't that you made a mistake, Morrison. The lesson is that you listened when I told you to correct it. In combat, that instant of listening, of trusting the voice of experience over your own panic, will save your life and the lives of everyone you're carrying. Never forget that. Morrison nodded slowly, and Vex could see the lesson sinking in, see him filing it away in the mental database that all good pilots build over years of flying. She dismissed the class, but Morrison lingered after the others had left. Captain Vex, he said hesitantly, can I ask you something? She nodded, gathering up her materials. What happened on your last combat mission, the one where you took shrapnel? Vex was quiet for a long moment, and Morrison wondered if he'd overstepped, if some questions shouldn't be asked. Then she set down her bag and looked at him with those eyes that had seen too much. It was August 2019, outside Jalalabad, she began, her voice distant. I was extracting a 6-man SEAL team that had stumbled into an ambush during a reconnaissance mission. They were pinned down in a compound with maybe 40 hostiles closing in from 3 sides. No air support available, no QRF close enough to help. Just me and my co-pilot, a kid named Jenkins who'd been flying for 2 years. She walked to the window, looking out at the helicopters lined up on the tarmac, their rotors still in the afternoon sun. We came in at dusk, no lights, using NVGs and whatever moonlight filtered through the dust. The SEALs had laid out an IR strobe to mark their position, and I could see tracer fire cutting across the compound like a light show from hell. Jenkins was terrified. I could hear it in his breathing over the intercom, but he held steady. We came in fast and low, landed in a courtyard that was maybe 20 feet wider than my rotor diameter, immediately took fire from 3 positions. She touched her left shoulder unconsciously, where the shrapnel had hit her. I felt the impact before I heard the explosion. IED on the compound wall, maybe 15 meters from my position. Shrapnel punched through the door and caught me here. She indicated her shoulder, and here, she touched her ribs on the left side. Blood everywhere, pain like I'd never felt. Jenkins was screaming at me to abort, to lift off, but I could see the SEALs running toward us, carrying one wounded, firing behind them as they came. If I lifted off, they died. Simple as that. Morrison was frozen, barely breathing as she told the story. So I held position. Held it while they loaded, while more fire came in, while Jenkins took the controls because I couldn't lift my left arm anymore. I talked him through it, talked him through holding steady despite the tracers and the RPGs, talked him through waiting those extra 15 seconds for the last SEAL to drag their wounded teammate aboard. Then I talked him through the takeoff, through climbing out while we were still taking fire, through flying the 70 kilometers back to base while I bled all over the cockpit. She turned back to Morrison, and her eyes were wet but her voice remained steady. We landed at Bagram with me barely conscious, all 6 SEALs alive, and Jenkins holding it together through sheer force of will. They gave me the Navy Cross for that mission, but the real hero was Jenkins. He was 24 years old, scared out of his mind, and he did everything right because he listened to training over fear. Vex picked up her bag and walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. That's what I'm trying to teach you, Morrison. Not how to fly helicopters, but how to fly them when everything is going wrong, when you're hurt or scared or certain you're about to die. Because that's when it matters most. Morrison stood alone in the briefing room after she left, understanding for the first time what it meant to be a combat pilot, what Vex had sacrificed, what she carried with her every day. He understood why she sat alone in the cafeteria, why she needed that silence, why she'd chosen to stay and train others rather than retire to some quiet life away from bases and helicopters and memories of missions that still woke her up at night. Word of Vex's training session spread, as everything about her seemed to spread, and more pilots began requesting her as an instructor. She taught them with a combination of technical precision and hard-won wisdom, showing them not just how to fly but how to survive, how to make decisions under pressure, how to bring everyone home. She was demanding but fair, tough but never cruel, and every pilot who trained under her came away better for the experience. In June, the battalion held a ceremony honoring veterans of special operations, and Vex was asked to speak. She declined at first, uncomfortable with public attention, but Colonel Wade convinced her that her words might matter to the younger generation of pilots and operators. So she stood on a stage in front of 500 personnel, wearing her dress whites with all the medals she usually kept in a drawer, and spoke for exactly 7 minutes. "I didn't become a pilot to be a hero," she said, her voice carrying across the assembly. "I became a pilot because I was good at it and because it needed doing. Every mission I flew, I was just trying to do my job, get in, get the team, get out alive. The only reason I succeeded was because of the people around me. The crew chiefs who kept my birds flying, the co-pilots who had my back, the ground teams who trusted me to pull them out of hell." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some young and eager, some scarred and knowing. "If there's anything I want you to remember from my service, it's this. Heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. It's about the Marine who holds the line while everyone else evacuates. It's about the SEAL who carries his wounded teammate when he can barely walk himself. It's about the pilot who stays in the LZ 30 seconds longer than safe because one more person needs to board. We're all terrified. We just don't let it stop us." The applause that followed was thunderous, genuine, and Vex stood there accepting it with the same calm dignity she'd shown in the cafeteria when Matson had tried to intimidate her. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She was doing it because someone needed to tell the truth about what combat actually was, not the sanitized version in movies, but the raw, terrifying, beautiful truth of people pushing past their limits to protect each other. After the ceremony, a line of personnel formed to speak with her, to shake her hand, to tell her what her service meant to them. Among them was Staff Sergeant Matson, who waited patiently at the end of the line. When he finally reached her, he handed her a small wooden plaque. She looked down at it and read the inscription, "Table 47, the Spectre's Table, reserved for heroes who need silence. Beneath the inscription was a carved image of a Seahawk helicopter. The whole battalion contributed, Matson said, his voice thick with emotion. We wanted you to know that we understand now, we get it, and we're honored to have you here. Vex held the plaque, her fingers tracing the carved helicopter, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly. Thank you, she said quietly. This means more than you know. Matson saluted. She returned it, and he walked away feeling like he'd just closed a circle, like something that began with ignorance and disrespect had ended with understanding and honor. That evening, Vex sat at table 47 in the empty cafeteria, the wooden plaque resting beside her book. She wasn't reading. She was just sitting in the silence, letting the peace wash over her, thinking about all the missions and all the years and all the people she'd flown home. She thought about Hawks, her old instructor, who taught her that fear was fuel if you knew how to use it. She thought about Jenkins, who she'd heard was now teaching pilots himself, passing on the lessons he'd learned in that bloody cockpit over Jalalabad. She thought about the hundreds of SEALs and Marines and Rangers who owed their lives to her skill and courage, who'd gone home to families and children and futures that wouldn't have existed if she'd been anything less than perfect on those critical missions. And she thought about the ones who hadn't made it home, the ones she couldn't save despite everything she'd tried, the faces that still visited her in dreams. This was why she sat alone. Not because she was antisocial or damaged, but because she carried this weight, these memories, this responsibility, and sometimes the only thing that helped was silence and solitude. The door to the cafeteria opened and Colonel Wade walked in, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He approached table 47, set 1 cup down in front of Vex, and sat across from her without asking permission. She looked up at him with a raised eyebrow but didn't object. Wade was one of the few people who understood what she'd been through, who'd flown his own missions in his own wars, who carried his own weight of memory. I heard your speech today, Wade said, sipping his coffee. It was good, better than good. You told them the truth, and that's rare. Vex wrapped her hands around her cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. Someone needed to. Too many kids come in here thinking combat is glory and valor. They need to know it's also fear and chaos and making impossible choices with incomplete information. Wade nodded, his face thoughtful. You ever regret it? The missions, the service, what it cost you? Vex was quiet for a long time, looking into her coffee as if it might hold answers. Every day and never, she finally said. I regret the toll it took, the relationships I couldn't maintain, the normalcy I gave up. But I don't regret the missions. Those men I brought home, they got to live. They got to see their kids grow up, got to have careers and weddings and grandchildren. How could I regret giving them that? Wade smiled sadly. That's what I thought you'd say. You know you don't have to keep doing this, right? You could retire tomorrow, take your pension, disappear. And do what? Vex asked, looking up at him with those gray eyes that had seen so much. Sit in a house somewhere and try to forget. No, this is where I belong. If I can teach one pilot to make better decisions, to be calmer under fire, to bring one more team home safe, then I need to be here. Wade raised his coffee cup in a small toast. To the ghosts who won't rest, he said. Vex clinked her cup against his. To the ghosts, she echoed. And in that moment, sitting across from someone who understood, she felt a little less alone.